Brené Brown's talk is really impressive on lots of different levels, not least because she's so aware of herself and she's so happy to share that with such an enormous audience. This talk has gone viral and has been seen by millions. One of the things that really stands out for me is that she is talking about how you cannot get to the fullness of life and connectivity and creativity without embracing a bit of vulnerability. That's useful for us as individuals to think about when we're working, but it's also useful to think about that in terms of groups and group dynamics, and remembering that that is exactly what's happening with groups as well. If you need them to move forward, you have to get them in touch with their emotions, and you have to work in such a way that you can manage that. Please don't take offence at all, anybody, at the cartoon. But what this cartoon sums up, forgetting the gender issues here, is that not only do we have a lot of emotions, but we can also find ways of preserving them, pickling them, and keeping them going for years on end. What exactly are emotions? Very often we talk about them more as feelings, jealousy, envy, outrage, but also enjoyment and excitement. Emotions are triggered by dynamics such as a sense of injustice, which in itself isn't a feeling, but it gets that feeling going of anger or fury. And defensiveness, which is more how we manage a feeling rather than the feeling itself, but they're also all together in that difficult mix. Why are we thinking about this? Well, in reality, emotions play a much bigger role in decision making than we realise. And in fact, if you look even at the riots in 2011 and think about what was going on there, that was a mixture of all sorts of things that had come together in quite a toxic way. So there was people's living contexts, their sense of aspiration, their needs, whether they were being fulfilled, but also just plain fury at being excluded. Let's just think for a moment about the conflict highs. What do we mean by that? Well, we've talked about the creative potential of conflict and its potential for opening up understanding, for deeper thinking. But Simmel, who wrote back in the early 20th century, but others who followed after, including Koza, write about people's psychological investment in conflict, enjoying our hatreds. I don't expect it's too hard for you, as it isn't for me, to think back to times where I've really got on my moral high horse about some upset with somebody and really got into that. I've enjoyed it. It's given me a sense of purpose. It's made me clear about who I am and what I think. The outrage has been exciting. And in fact, Simmel talks about how conflicts really build societies. If we imagine this idea of people closing their boundaries, then the cohesion within groups becomes a lot stronger. And there's these ideas of bridging and bonding. So as boundaries get defended, inside the boundaries, communities bond. But the bridging with other societies breaks down. So conflict can give a community a sense of purpose, and it can give them a knowledge of place in life and some solidarity. And this was clearly evidenced by a study of suicides in Northern Ireland after the signing of the Peace Accord only some 10 to 12 years ago. Suddenly, the suicide rate among young men rocketed in Northern Ireland. What was that about? Well, when they explored it carefully, it really seemed to have a strong correlation, a strong link to the fact that as the peace accord had been signed and they no longer could strongly identify with one side or the other, they didn't really know what to do with themselves. They lost a sense of self and a sense of direction. And associated that with that then was a higher rate of suicide. So giving up a long time position does require making ourselves feel more vulnerable. So in that situation, in order to accommodate themselves to the new reality, they had to put down their highly defended position as belonging to one group or another. That is what's required to move into a greater sense of life. Moving from a long-held position requires all sorts of accommodations, internal accommodations for us. But when you want to resolve hurt feelings in a process, and very often in a community conflict, you can see how one group has unwittingly, just as much as deliberately, offended another group. Parties involved need to be able to acknowledge that hurt in a way where they can keep their dignity. If you back people into a corner, they don't find it easy to move from their position. A very key way of accessing that deeper layer of sort of shame and hurt and upset is using storytelling. As people tell their stories, they're not just telling you facts, they're also telling you about their feelings. And John Winslade has written very interestingly about the use of narrative mediation, which is linked to narrative therapy, to help people think about how they might revisit that story that they've told themselves about a hurt and rewrite it in a new way, a new story. But there's some levels of hurt and anger which are so deep and out of sight that it's really hard to work with. And that hidden shame is often linked to some form of early humiliation or alienation. On the next slide, we're going to start thinking about anger and where does anger come from? Ours, but also the people that we work with. Anger is something that we're all familiar with, both our own, but also people who we come up against at home and at work, and sometimes out in community. What is useful is to think of anger as being rooted in some deep need, some unmet need, as Marshall Rosenberg would talk about it. Rosenberg's work on nonviolent communication is about thinking how meeting somebody at a point of anger is about recognising that hurt and talking to them not from a head position but from a heart position, showing them some sense of empathy. Here on this slide is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which was developed by him in the 1940s and has been hugely influential about how people have thought about human beings and what they need to reach their full potential. To some degree, everybody has to climb this ladder of needs in order to reach themselves and what they can do at their peak. And those basic needs of survival and belonging are essential for people in order to feel safe and secure. When those are threatened, we feel at our most vulnerable. That's a useful thing to think about, also in relation to what Brené Brown was talking about earlier in this session. This particular example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is topped by a cup of tea, but he didn't put that on his. He stopped with what he called self-actualization, which we might describe as reaching our full potential.
This exercise is called Unpicking Anger. What we'd like you to do is download the anger triangle and think of a time when you lost your temper and fill it in as accurately as possible. Think of this triangle in relation to the PIN model that we covered in session 5. And notice the similarities between the two. When people are in dispute, what they say in anger is likely to be positional, and it's not necessarily what they really want or need.